Sometimes the most powerful lessons come from the most unexpected places. In a world where money talks loudest and respect is often bought rather than earned, there are still guardians who stand for something greater than wealth. This is the true story of how one moment of arrogance met its match in the most spectacular way possible. What happens when unlimited privilege crashes headfirst into unshakable duty? When someone who has never heard the word no finally meets someone who cannot be bought, threatened, or intimidated, this isn't just another story about the rich and powerful getting their way. This is about the day someone learned that true authority doesn't come from a bank account and that some people still believe in honor above everything else. Prepare yourself for a story that will restore your faith in justice, remind you that dignity cannot be purchased, and show you what happens when someone finally stands up to unchecked arrogance in the most unforgettable way imaginable. The black Rolls-Royce Phantom pulled up to the ornate gates of Buckingham Palace with an arrogance that seemed to radiate from its polished chrome bumpers. Behind the wheel sat Marcus Rothwell, a man whose net worth had more zeros than most people could count, and whose attitude had grown proportionally with each additional million in his portfolio. At 42 years old, Marcus had never encountered a door that his money couldn't open, a person who wouldn't bend to his will, or a situation he couldn't control through the sheer force of his financial influence. Born into old money and having multiplied it 100-fold through ruthless business dealings, he had developed the kind of entitled worldview that comes from never having to face real consequences for his actions. The morning London air was crisp as Marcus stepped out of his vehicle, his handmade Italian leather shoes hitting the pavement with a click that seemed to announce his importance to the world. He wore a suit that cost more than most people's monthly salary, and his platinum watch caught the early sunlight like a beacon of his success. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his manicured hands bore a signet ring passed down through generations of wealth, and his cold blue eyes surveyed the palace grounds as if he were already calculating their market value. Marcus had come to London on business, closing a deal that would add another $100 million to his already obscene fortune. But business was just the excuse. The real reason for his visit was to show off, to demonstrate his power and influence to the various politicians, business leaders, and social climbers who orbited around wealth like moths around a flame. What better way to do that than to casually mention over dinner that he had personally visited Buckingham Palace, perhaps even implying some connection to royalty itself? Standing guard at the palace gates was Sergeant James Mitchell, a man who represented everything Marcus. At 35, James had dedicated his life to service, first in the British Army where he had completed multiple tours in Afghanistan, and now as a member of the elite Queen's Guard. His red tunic was immaculate, his black bearskin hat perfectly positioned, and his rifle held with the precise military bearing that came from years of discipline and training. James had grown up in a working-class family in Manchester. His father had been a factory worker, his mother a nurse, and both had instilled in him the values of hard work, respect, and duty to something greater than oneself. When he was 18, James had enlisted in the Army not because he had no other options, but because he genuinely believed in serving his country. He had seen combat, had friends who didn't make it home, and had learned the true meaning of sacrifice in ways that no amount of money could ever teach. The contrast between the two men couldn't have been more stark. Marcus saw the world as something to be owned, controlled, and consumed. James saw it as something to be protected, honored, and served. Marcus measured success in dollars and dominance. James measured it in duty fulfilled and integrity maintained. As Marcus approached the palace gates, he carried with him the kind of casual arrogance that had been brewing for decades. He had just come from a meeting where he had acquired a historic building in central London simply because he could. The seller had been reluctant, emotionally attached to the property that had been in his family for generations. But Marcus had made an offer so overwhelming that resistance became impossible. It was a pattern he had repeated countless times throughout his life, and he expected this morning to follow the same script. The palace grounds were bustling with the usual mix of tourists, official visitors, and staff going about their daily routines. Marcus observed it all with the detached interest of someone surveying property he might purchase. He had heard that tours were available for certain areas of the palace, and in his mind, money would surely expedite the process and perhaps even open doors that were normally closed to the public. James had been on duty since 6 in the morning, and it was now approaching 10. He had already dealt with dozens of tourists trying to get photos with him, several attempts by visitors to engage him in conversation despite the well-known protocol that guards remain silent and motionless, and one particularly persistent journalist who seemed convinced that James would break character for the right question. Through it all, he had maintained his professional composure, his eyes forward, his expression neutral, his commitment to his duty unwavering. The role of a Queen's Guard was not just ceremonial, though many people mistakenly believed it to be. His men and women were fully operational soldiers, trained in combat, armed, and responsible for the actual security of one of the most important buildings in Britain. The colorful uniforms and traditional ceremonies were steeped in centuries of history, but beneath the pageantry was deadly serious business. James had earned his position through years of exemplary service, rigorous testing, and unwavering dedication. He took pride not just in the honor of the role, but in the responsibility it represented. When he stood guard, he wasn't just a man in a costume performing for tourists. He was a living symbol of the values and traditions that had built and sustained a nation. As Marcus drew closer to the gates, his confidence grew. He had dealt with security personnel around the world, from corporate headquarters to government buildings to exclusive private clubs. In his experience, everyone had a price, everyone could be influenced, and everyone would ultimately defer to sufficient wealth and power. He saw no reason why this situation would be any different. The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the palace courtyard. Other visitors moved respectfully around the perimeter, some taking photos from appropriate distances, others simply enjoying the historical significance of being so close to such an iconic location. Children pressed their faces against the ornate iron bars of the gates, wide-eyed with wonder at the fairy tale magnificence of the palace beyond. Marcus paid little attention to the other visitors. His focus was entirely on the guard standing at attention near the main entrance. He had already decided on his approach, had already calculated the most efficient way to get what he wanted. In his mind, this would be a simple transaction like so many others he had completed throughout his life. But James Mitchell was not like the other people Marcus Rothwell had encountered in his privileged existence. James represented something that money couldn't buy, influence couldn't sway, and threats couldn't intimidate. He represented principles that had been forged in combat, tested under fire, and strengthened through years of dedicated service to something far greater than personal gain. As the distance between them closed, neither man could have predicted how this encounter would unfold. Marcus approached with all the casual arrogance of someone who had never been truly challenged. James stood ready with all the quiet strength of someone who had faced real challenges and emerged victorious, not through wealth or connections, but through character and commitment. The stage was set for a collision between two completely different worldviews, two opposing philosophies of life, two men who represented everything the other was not. The morning air seemed to hold its breath as Marcus Rothwell, accustomed to getting whatever he wanted whenever he wanted it, prepared to meet James Mitchell, a man sworn to protect something that could never be bought or sold. What happened next would be talked about for years to come, shared in military circles, remembered by witnesses, and serve as a reminder that in a world increasingly dominated by wealth and privilege, there are still some people who stand for something more important than money. The confrontation that was about to unfold would prove that dignity, honor, and duty are not commodities to be purchased, but virtues to be earned and defended. The clash between unlimited arrogance and unwavering principle was about to begin. Marcus strode across the courtyard with the kind of purposeful gait that had intimidated boardrooms full of corporate executives and government officials. His expensive shoes clicked against the ancient stones as he made his way directly toward Sergeant James Mitchell, completely ignoring the clearly marked barriers and signs that indicated appropriate distances for public visitors. The first sign that this encounter would be different from Marcus's usual experiences came when he reached what he considered to be conversational distance from the guard. James didn't acknowledge his approach with so much as a flicker of his eyes. The sergeant remained perfectly motionless, his gaze fixed straight ahead, his rifle held at precisely the correct angle, his entire bearing radiating the kind of professional discipline that comes from years of military training. Marcus was accustomed to immediate attention. When he entered a room, conversations stopped. When he approached someone, they turned to face him with expressions of eager anticipation, hoping to curry favor with his obvious wealth and power. The complete lack of response from the guard was so foreign to his experience that he initially assumed it must be some kind of misunderstanding. "Excuse me," Marcus said, his voice carrying the tone of someone used to being heard and obeyed immediately. "I'd like to speak with someone about arranging a private tour of the palace." The silence that followed was complete. James continued to stare straight ahead, his expression unchanging, his posture unwavering. It was as if Marcus had spoken to a statue, or perhaps to the wind itself. The lack of response triggered something in Marcus that he rarely experienced. Confusion followed quickly by irritation. Marcus took a step closer, now well within the boundaries that other visitors respected. "I said I want to speak to someone about a tour. Are you deaf, or just ignoring me?" Still, nothing. James had been trained for exactly this type of situation. Tourists and visitors regularly attempted to engage the guards in conversation, sometimes out of innocent curiosity, sometimes as a challenge to see if they could break the famous British Reserve, and occasionally with more aggressive or disrespectful intentions. The protocol was clear and non-negotiable. Maintain position, maintain silence, maintain dignity. But Marcus Rothwell was not used to protocol that applied to him. Throughout his life, rules had been suggestions that could be bent or broken with sufficient financial pressure. Restrictions were obstacles to be overcome rather than boundaries to be respected. The very concept that someone would simply ignore his presence and his clearly stated desires was so alien to his worldview that he began to process it as a personal insult rather than professional duty. "Listen to me, you tin soldier," Marcus said, his voice rising with irritation. "I'm not some tourist looking for a photo opportunity. I'm Marcus Rothwell. Perhaps you've heard of Rothwell Industries? I employ more people than this entire palace staff, and I pay more in taxes than you'll earn in your entire military career." The mention of his name and wealth had been Marcus's go-to strategy for decades. It was his universal key, his magic phrase that opened doors and changed attitudes instantly. Corporate executives, government officials, even foreign dignitaries had all responded to that introduction with immediate deference and accommodation. But James Mitchell had never heard of Marcus Rothwell, would not have cared if he had, and was bound by a duty that transcended any civilian's self-perceived importance. James's training had prepared him for far worse than verbal intimidation. He had faced enemy combatants who wanted to kill him, had endured interrogation scenarios designed to break his will, and had learned to maintain his composure under pressures that would crush most civilians. A wealthy man's wounded ego and raised voice barely registered on the scale of challenges he had overcome. The continued silence began to transform Marcus's irritation into genuine anger. In his world, silence was submission, and submission was weakness. He interpreted James's professional composure as disrespect, his duty-bound behavior as a personal slight. The fact that this uniformed man would dare to ignore Marcus Rothwell struck him as an intolerable violation of the natural order as he understood it. "Are you going to stand there and pretend you can't hear me?" Marcus demanded, stepping even closer to the guard. "I'm talking to you, soldier boy. When someone with my status and influence speaks to you, you respond. That's how the world works." Other visitors in the area had begun to notice the confrontation. A family with young children moved away uncomfortably, not wanting their morning outing to be disrupted by what was clearly becoming an unpleasant scene. An elderly couple exchanged worried glances, and several tourists began pulling out their phones, sensing that something dramatic might be about to unfold. James was acutely aware of the attention the situation was drawing, but his training had prepared him for public incidents as well. Part of being a Queen's Guard was understanding that everything you did was observed, analyzed, and potentially recorded. Every action, every response, every decision would reflect not just on him personally, but on the entire institution he represented. The weight of that responsibility was something he carried with pride rather than burden. Marcus misinterpreted the gathering attention as validation of his position. In his mind, these witnesses would see how this disrespectful soldier was treating a man of his stature, and their shock would force the guard to recognize his error and respond appropriately. He had never considered the possibility that the gathering crowd might be appalled by his behavior rather than supportive of his position. "This is ridiculous," Marcus continued, his voice now loud enough to carry across much of the courtyard. "I don't have time for this theatrical nonsense. I have meetings with members of Parliament this afternoon, and I wanted to mention that I had personally toured the palace. Now, either you direct me to someone who can arrange that, or I'll make sure your commanding officers hear about how one of their guards treated a visiting dignitary." The threat was delivered with the confidence of someone who had used similar leverage countless times before. Marcus had toppled corporate executives with phone calls, had ruined political careers with well-placed pressure, and had destroyed business competitors through strategic applications of influence and intimidation. In his mind, this uniformed man, regardless of his training or position, was just another obstacle to be overcome through the application of sufficient force. But James Mitchell was not a corporate executive worried about his bonus, or a politician concerned about his re-election chances, or a business competitor who could be bought off or intimidated into submission. He was a soldier who had sworn an oath, a guardian bound by duty, and a man whose sense of honor had been forged in circumstances far more challenging than anything a wealthy civilian could threaten him with. The sergeant's silence continued, absolute and unwavering. His eyes remained fixed on a point in the distance, his breathing steady and controlled, his grip on his rifle unchanged. To the gathering observers, he appeared as immovable as the palace itself, as permanent and unshakable as the monarchy he served. This complete lack of response pushed Marcus past irritation, past anger, and into a realm of fury he rarely experienced. Throughout his life, he had been able to control situations through various combinations of wealth, influence, charm, or intimidation. When one approach failed, he simply escalated to the next level until he achieved the desired result. But he had never encountered someone who seemed completely immune to all of his usual methods of persuasion. "Fine," Marcus snarled, his face beginning to redden with rage. "You want to play games? You want to act like some kind of robot? Let me tell you something about the real world, you pathetic excuse for a soldier. I could buy this entire operation. I could have you transferred to some miserable posting where you'll spend the rest of your career guarding sheep in the Scottish Highlands. I know people who could make your life very unpleasant very quickly." The threats continued to escalate, but they seemed to dissipate harmlessly against James's professional composure like waves breaking against a seawall. Each escalation, each new level of verbal aggression, each attempt to intimidate or demean him only served to demonstrate the vast gulf between Marcus's understanding of power and James's understanding of duty. Witnesses to the confrontation were beginning to show clear signs of discomfort and disapproval. The family with children had moved to the far side of the courtyard, and several adults were shaking their heads in disgust at Marcus's behavior. A few tourists were indeed recording the incident, but their sympathies were clearly with the disciplined guard rather than the ranting civilian. Marcus remained oblivious to the shifting mood of the crowd. In his narcissistic worldview, any attention was validation, any reaction was acknowledgement of his importance. He couldn't conceive of the possibility that the people around him were judging his behavior negatively rather than being impressed by his persistence and authority. The confrontation had reached a critical point. Marcus had exhausted his usual repertoire of influence tactics and found them all ineffective. His wealthy man's ego, unused to being denied or ignored, was driving him toward increasingly desperate and inappropriate responses. James, meanwhile, continued to embody the very principles that Marcus found so incomprehensible: duty before self-interest, honor before convenience, service before personal gain. What happened next would transform this encounter from an embarrassing display of entitled behavior into something far more serious and far more memorable. The morning sun had climbed higher, casting shorter shadows across the palace courtyard as Marcus Rothwell's frustration reached a boiling point. What had begun as an expectation of easy accommodation had evolved into a personal crusade against what he perceived as intolerable disrespect. In his mind, this silent guard had become a symbol of everything that dared to resist his will, everything that failed to recognize his superiority, everything that needed to be conquered and controlled. Marcus began pacing back and forth in front of James like a caged animal seeking any sign of weakness or vulnerability. His expensive suit was beginning to show signs of perspiration despite the cool London morning, and his perfectly styled hair was becoming disheveled as his agitation increased. The transformation from composed businessman to frustrated bully was becoming more apparent with each passing moment. "You know what your problem is?" Marcus said, stopping directly in front of James and pointing an accusatory finger at the guard's chest. "You've forgotten your place in the world. You think wearing that ridiculous costume makes you important, but you're nothing more than a museum piece, a tourist attraction, a relic from a bygone era when people actually respected authority." James could feel the heat radiating from Marcus's proximity, could smell the expensive cologne mixed with the scent of growing desperation, but his training had prepared him for far more intimidating encounters than this. He had faced enemy soldiers who wanted to kill him, had endured interrogations designed to break his spirit, and had learned to maintain his composure under pressures that would shatter most civilians. A wealthy man's tantrum was merely background noise compared to the genuine dangers he had faced in service to his country. The crowd of onlookers had grown larger, drawn by the increasingly dramatic nature of the confrontation. What had started as mild curiosity was now becoming genuine concern as Marcus's behavior became more erratic and aggressive. Several tourists were openly filming the incident, sensing that they were witnessing something that would be talked about and shared for a long time to come. Among the witnesses was an elderly veteran named Arthur Pemberton, who had served in the Royal Navy during the Falklands War. He recognized immediately what was happening and felt a growing anger at watching a civilian attack the dignity of a serving soldier. Arthur had seen too many good men and women sacrifice too much for their country to stand quietly while someone like Marcus attempted to humiliate one of their own. Also watching was Sarah Chen, a young journalist who had been at the palace researching a piece about modern royal security protocols. She understood the significance of what she was observing and began taking detailed notes, recognizing that this incident represented something larger than just one man's bad behavior. But Marcus was oblivious to the growing disapproval of the crowd. In his narcissistic bubble, he interpreted their attention as validation of his position rather than condemnation of his actions. He had never developed the ability to read social situations accurately because he had never needed to care about other people's opinions. Money and power had insulated him from consequences for so long that he had lost touch with normal human interactions. "I'll tell you what's going to happen here," Marcus continued, his voice rising to a level that could be heard clearly across the entire courtyard. "You're going to acknowledge me, you're going to show me the respect I deserve, and you're going to help me get what I came for. Because if you don't, I'm going to make sure everyone knows how a British soldier treated a major international investor and taxpayer." The threat was delivered with the confidence of someone who had used similar leverage successfully many times before. Marcus had destroyed careers with phone calls, had ruined businesses with strategic pressure, and had bent countless people to his will through the application of wealth and influence. But he had never encountered someone whose sense of duty transcended personal consequences. someone whose commitment to their principles was stronger than their fear of retaliation. James had been standing guard for over 4 hours now, and his physical training allowed him to maintain his position without any sign of fatigue or discomfort. But more importantly, his mental discipline was keeping him focused on his duty despite the escalating provocation. He understood that Marcus was trying to break his composure, trying to force some kind of reaction that would validate the wealthy man's sense of superiority. The sergeant had encountered many difficult people during his years of service. He had dealt with drunken civilians, aggressive protesters, mentally unstable individuals, and foreign nationals who didn't understand or respect British customs. In every case, he had maintained his professionalism and upheld the standards expected of someone in his position. This encounter, while unusually persistent and publicly humiliating, was not fundamentally different from those previous challenges. But Marcus's next escalation would cross a line that transformed the situation from merely unpleasant, "You think you're better than me?" Marcus screamed, now completely losing control of his emotions. "You think your little uniform makes you special? Let me show you what I think of your precious British tradition." Without warning, Marcus drew back and spat directly in James's face. The act was so sudden, so unexpected, and so profoundly disrespectful that for a moment, the entire courtyard fell silent. The saliva struck James on his left cheek and began to drip slowly down toward his collar, but the guard's expression remained unchanged. His eyes continued to stare straight ahead, his posture remained perfect, his grip on his rifle stayed steady and controlled. But something fundamental had shifted in that moment. What had been a verbal confrontation between a civilian and a soldier had become an assault on everything James represented. The spit wasn't just aimed at him personally, it was an attack on his uniform, his service, his country, and every soldier who had ever stood guard in defense of something greater than themselves. The crowd's reaction was immediate and visceral. Several people gasped audibly. Others began expressing their outrage in increasingly loud voices, and more phones appeared as witnesses realized they had just observed something that would likely have serious consequences. The family with children, who had been trying to leave quietly, stopped and stared in shock. The elderly veteran, Arthur Pemberton, began pushing through the crowd with a look of fury on his weathered face. "That's absolutely disgraceful," shouted a woman with a Scottish accent. "How dare you treat a soldier like that?" "Someone should call the police," said another voice from the crowd. "Get that man away from the guard," demanded a third observer. But Marcus seemed energized by the reaction his action had provoked. In his twisted understanding of the situation, he had finally forced a response, finally broken through the guard's professional facade, finally asserted his dominance over someone who had dared to ignore his importance. "There," Marcus said with satisfaction, pulling out an expensive handkerchief to wipe his mouth. "Now you know what I think of your precious ceremony and your stubborn silence. Maybe next time you'll remember to show proper respect when someone of my caliber addresses you." James felt the warm saliva continuing to drip down his face, but his training held firm. He had been insulted, physically assaulted, and publicly humiliated, but his duty remained unchanged. He was there to guard the palace, to represent the crown, to uphold the traditions and values of the British military. No civilian's behavior, no matter how despicable, would cause him to abandon his post or compromise his principles. But while James maintained his composure, the same could not be said for everyone present. The crowd's anger was building to a dangerous level, and several people were beginning to move closer to Marcus with obviously hostile intentions. The elderly veteran was now within a few feet of the wealthy man, and his face showed the kind of controlled rage that comes from decades of military discipline, barely containing a desire for physical retribution. "You miserable excuse for a human being," Arthur Pemberton said in a voice that carried the authority of someone who had faced real combat and real sacrifice. "That soldier has more honor in his little finger than you have in your entire worthless existence." Marcus turned to face this new challenger with the same arrogant confidence he had shown toward the guard. He saw an old man in casual clothes and assumed he represented no more of a threat than anyone else who had dared to oppose him. "Mind your own business, Grandpa," Marcus sneered. "This is between me and Tin Soldier here, unless you want to volunteer to teach him some manners as well." It was at that moment that Marcus Rothwell made what would prove to be the biggest mistake of his entire privileged life. He had pushed too far, insulted too much, and shown too little respect for too many things that other people held sacred. The confrontation that had begun with his expectation of easy accommodation was about to escalate into consequences he had never imagined possible. The stage was set for a reckoning that would be remembered, shared, and celebrated as an example of what happens when unlimited arrogance finally meets immovable principle. Marcus had sown the wind with his disrespect and cruelty. Now he was about to reap the whirlwind of a response that would be truly unforgettable. The transformation in the crowd's mood was immediate and dramatic. What had begun as uncomfortable disapproval of Marcus's behavior had evolved into open hostility following his assault on the guard. But it was Arthur Pemberton, the elderly naval veteran, who became the focal point of the collective outrage that was building in the courtyard. "Grandpa?" Arthur repeated, his voice carrying decades of command authority despite his civilian clothes. "Let me tell you something about this Grandpa, you pathetic waste of oxygen. I served 22 years in Her Majesty's Navy. I fought in the Falklands when you were probably still having your nappies changed by servants. And I've never seen such a disgraceful display of cowardice and disrespect in my entire life." Marcus looked around the crowd for the first time and finally began to recognize that the situation was not developing as he had expected. Instead of the validation and support he had assumed would come from his display of dominance, he saw faces filled with disgust, anger, and contempt. The phones that were pointed in his direction weren't capturing his moment of triumph. They were recording what would soon become evidence of his shame. But Marcus's ego was so inflated, his sense of entitlement so complete, that he still couldn't accept the possibility that he was wrong. Instead, he doubled down on his aggression. Convinced that he could intimidate his way out of the situation, just as he had countless times before in boardrooms and business negotiations. "I don't care if you're a war hero or the Queen's personal butler," Marcus snarled at Arthur. "This has nothing to do with you, and I suggest you walk away before you get yourself into trouble you can't handle." Arthur Pemberton had faced enemy fire, had seen friends die in combat, and had spent decades serving his country with honor and distinction. The idea that this wealthy bully thought he could intimidate someone who had survived real battles was so absurd that it almost made him laugh. Almost. "The only person here who's in trouble he can't handle is you," Arthur replied calmly, "and you're about to find out just how much trouble that is." The crowd was growing larger as word of the confrontation spread throughout the palace grounds. Tourists who had been exploring other areas were drawn by the commotion. Palace staff members were beginning to take notice, and several official-looking individuals in suits were making their way toward the scene. The incident that Marcus had thought would be a private demonstration of his power was becoming a very public spectacle. Sarah Chen, the journalist, was frantically taking notes and photos, recognizing that she was witnessing something that would make headlines not just in Britain but around the world. The image of a wealthy man spitting on a Queen's Guard would become a symbol of entitled arrogance meeting British stoicism, and she knew her editor would want every detail. Among the approaching officials was Inspector David Morrison of the Metropolitan Police, who had been conducting a routine security briefing with palace personnel when reports of the disturbance reached him. Morrison had 20 years of experience dealing with difficult situations, and he could see from a distance that this particular incident was escalating beyond the usual tourist misbehavior. But before the authorities could intervene, Arthur Pemberton decided to take action that would give Marcus Rothwell a lesson in respect that money couldn't buy and lawyers couldn't reverse. "You want to know what real authority looks like?" Arthur asked, his voice now carrying to every corner of the courtyard. "Real authority doesn't need to shout, it doesn't need to threaten, and it certainly doesn't need to assault someone who can't fight back because of their duty and professionalism." Arthur turned to address the entire crowd, his naval training allowing him to project his voice clearly despite his age. Ladies and gentlemen, what you've witnessed here today is a perfect example of the difference between wealth and worth. This man, he pointed at Marcus, thinks his money makes him important, but that soldier, he gestured toward James, has dedicated his life to serving something greater than himself. The crowd began to murmur their agreement, and Marcus finally started to realize that his usual tactics weren't working. For the first time in decades, he was in a situation where his wealth and influence seemed to carry no weight at all. The people around him weren't impressed by his expensive suit or his claims of importance. They were disgusted by his behavior and sympathetic to the guard he had assaulted. "This is ridiculous," Marcus protested, his voice becoming higher and more defensive. "I'm a successful businessman, a job creator, a taxpayer. I deserve respect, not this mob mentality from a bunch of tourists and has-been soldiers." Arthur smiled grimly. "Respect is earned, not purchased. And you've just shown everyone exactly how little you deserve any." Inspector Morrison finally reached the scene, his trained eyes quickly assessing the situation. He could see the spit still glistening on Sergeant Mitchell's face, could observe the aggressive posture of the well-dressed civilian, and could feel the tension radiating from the crowd of increasingly angry onlookers. "Right then," Morrison said in the calm, authoritative voice that British police officers perfect over years of dealing with public disturbances. "What seems to be the problem here?" Multiple voices began speaking at once, but Arthur Pemberton's military bearing helped him take control of the narrative. "Inspector, this gentleman has been verbally abusing this soldier for the past 20 minutes, and then he spat in his face. We all saw it. There are dozens of witnesses and probably hundreds of photos and videos." Morrison looked at Marcus with the expression of a man who had seen every type of antisocial behavior imaginable. "Is this true, sir?" Marcus felt a moment of panic as he realized that the situation had moved beyond his ability to control through usual means. With Trust Teddy, he was facing a police officer surrounded by hostile witnesses, and for the first time in his adult life, his money and connections seemed powerless to protect him from the consequences of his actions. "Officer, there's been a misunderstanding," Marcus said, trying to regain his composure and return to the smooth, confident persona that had served him so well in business. "I'm Marcus Rothwell of Rothwell Industries. I was simply trying to arrange a private tour of the palace, and this guard was being uncooperative. Perhaps we could discuss this privately." The implication was clear. Marcus was suggesting that money could make this problem disappear, just as money had made so many other problems disappear throughout his life. But Inspector Morrison had dealt with wealthy individuals who thought they could buy their way out of legal consequences, and he was thoroughly unimpressed by the attempt. "Sir, if you assaulted a member of the Queen's Guard, that's a serious offense regardless of your financial status or business connections," Morrison replied firmly. "I'm going to need to see some identification, and I'll be speaking with witnesses about exactly what happened here." Marcus reached for his wallet with hands that were beginning to shake slightly. For the first time in decades, he was experiencing genuine fear about consequences he couldn't control or avoid. The crowd around him was openly hostile. The police officer was treating him like a common criminal, and the guard he had humiliated was standing there like a living symbol of everything Marcus had failed to destroy. But Arthur Pemberton wasn't finished delivering his lesson in humility. The veteran had served his country with honor, had seen good soldiers make sacrifices that Marcus couldn't comprehend, and he was determined to make sure this wealthy bully understood exactly what he had attacked when he spat on that guard. "Inspector," Arthur said, "before you take this man's statement, I think there's something else you should know about Mr. Rothwell here." Marcus felt his stomach drop as he realized that his ordeal was far from over. Whatever this old veteran had planned, it was going to be delivered in front of witnesses, recorded by cameras, and remembered by everyone present. The response to his arrogance was just beginning, and it was going to be far more comprehensive and devastating than anything his wealth and influence had ever protected him from before. The reckoning that Marcus Rothwell had never believed could happen to someone like him was about to begin in earnest. Arthur Pemberton stepped closer to Marcus, his weathered face bearing the kind of controlled intensity that comes from decades of military discipline. The crowd had grown silent, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Job reacted to me. Even Inspector Morrison paused his questioning, recognizing that the veteran had something important to say. "You see, Inspector," Arthur began, his voice carrying clearly across the courtyard. "Mr. Rothwell here seems to think that spitting on a soldier is acceptable behavior for someone of his supposed stature. But what he doesn't understand is that this particular soldier, Sergeant Mitchell, is wearing more than just a uniform." Arthur gestured toward James, who continued to stand at attention despite the saliva still visible on his face. "That man served 2 tours in Afghanistan. He was awarded the Military Cross for gallantry after he single-handedly held off an enemy attack while his wounded comrades were evacuated. 3 of his friends didn't make it home from that deployment, but Sergeant Mitchell continued to serve because he believes in something greater than his own comfort or safety." The crowd began to murmur with newfound respect as they learned about James's background. Marcus felt the hostile attention of hundreds of eyes focusing on him with increasing intensity. For the first time in his life, he was beginning to understand that there were forms of authority and respect that couldn't be purchased or negotiated. Arthur wasn't finished. "But Mr. Rothwell here thinks his money makes him more important than someone who has actually sacrificed for his country. He thinks his business success gives him the right to humiliate a decorated war hero who can't defend himself because of his professional duties." Sarah Chen was frantically documenting every word, knowing that this story would resonate far beyond London. The image of wealth and privilege attacking military service and honor would strike a chord with people around the world who were tired of watching entitled individuals escape consequences for their actions. Inspector Morrison had heard enough to make his assessment of the situation. "Mr. Rothwell, I'm placing you under arrest for assault. You have the right to remain silent, but anything you do say may be given in evidence." Marcus felt his world beginning to collapse around him. "Arrest? You can't arrest me! I'm a major international businessman. I have meetings with Parliament members this afternoon. I contribute millions in taxes. This is all a misunderstanding, sir. Spitting on someone is assault under British law," Morrison replied calmly. "Your financial status doesn't exempt you from legal consequences for your actions." As the handcuffs clicked into place around Marcus's wrists, Arthur delivered the final element of his lesson. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced to the crowd, "I want you all to remember this moment. Remember that money can't buy honor. Remember that true strength comes from service to others, not from dominating them. And remember that there are still people in this world who will stand up for what's right even when it's difficult." The crowd erupted in spontaneous applause, their approval directed not at Marcus's humiliation, but at the principles Arthur had articulated and the dignity that Sergeant Mitchell had maintained throughout the ordeal. Several people began approaching James to thank him for his service, though they maintained respectful distances as he remained on duty. But Arthur wasn't quite finished with Marcus yet. As the police officer prepared to lead him away, the veteran stepped directly in front of the handcuffed businessman. "Mr. Rothwell," Arthur said quietly, "you asked that soldier for respect, but you never offered any in return. You demanded recognition for your wealth, but you showed no recognition for his sacrifice. You wanted special treatment because of what you own, but you gave no special consideration for what he's given." Marcus tried to maintain some semblance of dignity, but his expensive suit was wrinkled, his hair was disheveled, and his hands were cuffed behind his back. "This is all going to be reversed," he said desperately. "My lawyers will have this dismissed before the day is over." "You people have no idea who you're dealing with." Arthur smiled sadly. "That's exactly the problem, isn't it? You still don't understand. Your lawyers might get you out of legal trouble, but they can't repair what you've destroyed here today. They can't undo the videos that are already being uploaded to social media. They can't erase the witnesses who will tell this story for years to come. And they certainly can't restore the respect you've lost from everyone who matters. As if to prove Arthur's point, Sarah Chen stepped forward with her press credentials visible. Mr. Rothwell, I'm a journalist with The Guardian. Would you like to make a statement about why you felt it was appropriate to assault a decorated war veteran who was performing his duty? Marcus's face went pale as he realized that this incident would likely become international news. His business reputation, his social standing, his carefully constructed image of success and respectability, all of it was crumbling because of one moment of uncontrolled arrogance. No comment, he muttered, turning away from the journalist's camera. But the damage was already done. Within hours, videos of the incident would be circulating on every social media platform. The image of a wealthy businessman in handcuffs after spitting on a Queen's Guard would become a symbol of entitled privilege meeting its match in British resolve and military honor. Inspector Morrison began leading Marcus toward the police vehicle that had arrived to transport him to the station, but before they left the courtyard, something happened that would become the most powerful part of the story that people would tell for years to come. Sergeant James Mitchell, who had maintained his professional composure throughout the entire ordeal, not to break his duty or abandon his post, but to perform one simple action that demonstrated the profound difference between his character and that of the man who had attacked him. James reached up with his free hand and, with precise military movements, removed a clean handkerchief from his pocket. He carefully wiped the spit from his face, folded the handkerchief neatly, and returned it to his pocket. Then he resumed his position, eyes forward, expression neutral, rifle at the correct angle. The action was so simple, so dignified, and so powerful that the entire crowd fell silent. Here was a man who had been publicly humiliated, physically assaulted, and verbally abused, yet he had maintained his composure and professionalism throughout. No angry words, no retaliation, no breakdown of discipline. Just the quiet strength of someone who understood that his duty transcended personal affronts. Arthur Pemberton began clapping slowly, and soon the entire crowd joined in sustained applause for the sergeant's display of grace under pressure. Several veterans in the crowd saluted. Tourists from around the world took pictures respectfully, and more than one person was seen wiping tears from their eyes. Marcus heard the applause as he was loaded into the police car, and he finally understood what he had lost. It wasn't just his freedom, his reputation, or his dignity. He had lost something far more valuable and far less replaceable: the respect of decent people and any claim to moral authority he might have possessed. As the police car drove away, carrying Marcus toward consequences he had never imagined possible, the crowd gradually dispersed. But the story of what had happened that morning would spread far beyond the palace grounds. It would be told in military barracks and civilian pubs, shared on social media, and discussed in Parliament, remembered by school children, and passed down through families. The story would become a modern parable about the difference between wealth and worth, between power and strength, between demanding respect and earning it. It would remind people that there are still individuals who stand for something greater than themselves, who maintain their principles even under attack, who embody the values that make civilization possible. Sergeant James Mitchell continued his guard duty for the remainder of his shift, never knowing that his quiet dignity in the face of unprovoked assault had restored faith in human decency for thousands of people around the world. He had done nothing more than his job, but in doing it with such unwavering professionalism, he had provided an unforgettable lesson in what true strength and honor look like. Marcus Rothwell would eventually be released on bail, would hire expensive lawyers who would minimize his legal consequences, and would return to his business empire largely intact financially. But he would never escape the memory of that morning when his unlimited arrogance met immovable principle and lost decisively. The response had been unforgettable indeed, not because of its violence or drama, but because of its demonstration that some things in this world remain sacred. Some people still stand for honor above personal gain, and some lessons can only be learned through the kind of humiliation that money cannot prevent or repair. The morning that Marcus Rothwell thought would showcase his importance instead became the day he learned that true authority comes not from what you own, but from what you stand for and what you're willing to sacrifice to defend it.